against him as she walked, and his body was like a taut string. Halfway up the big colonnade of elms, where the grove rose highest above the river, their forward movement faltered to an end. He led her across to the grass, under the trees at the edge of the path. The cliff of red earth sloped swiftly down, through trees and bushes, to the river that glimmered and was dark between the foliage. The far below water meadows were very green. He and she stood leaning against one another, silent, afraid, their bodies touching all along. There came a quick gurgle from the river below. "Why," he asked at length, "did you hate Baxter Dawes?" She turned to him with a splendid movement. Her mouth was offered him, and her throat. Her eyes were half shut. Her breast was tilted as if it asked for him. He flashed with a small laugh, shut his eyes, and met her in a long, whole kiss. Her mouth fused with his. Their bodies were sealed and annealed. It was some minutes before they withdrew. They were standing beside the public path. She looked at him, leaving herself in his hands. He went over the brim of the declivity and began to climb down. "It's slippery," he said. "Never mind," she replied. The red clay went down almost sheer. He slid, went from one tuft of grass to the next, hanging on to the bushes, making for a little platform at the foot of a tree. There he waited for her, laughing with excitement. Her shoes were clogged with red earth. It was hard for her. He frowned. At last he caught her hand, and she stood beside him. The cliff rose above them and fell away below. Her colour was up, her eyes flashed. He looked at the big drop below them. "It's risky," he said. "Or messy, at any rate. Shall we go back?" "Not for my sake," she said quickly. "All right. You see, I can't help you. I should only hinder. Give me that little parcel and your gloves. Your poor shoes." They stood perched on the face of the declivity under the trees. "Well, I'll go again," he said. Away he went, slipping, staggering, sliding to the next tree, into which he fell with a slam that nearly shook the breath out of him. She came after cautiously, hanging on to the twigs and grasses. So they descended, stage by stage, to the river's brink. There, to his disgust, the flood had eaten away the path, and the red decline ran straight into the water. He dug in his heels and brought himself up violently. The string of the parcel broke with a snap. The brown parcel bounded down, leaped into the water, and sailed smoothly away. He hung on to his tree. "Well, I'll be damned!" he cried crossly. Then he laughed. She was coming perilously down. "Mind!" he warned her. He stood with his back to the tree, waiting. "Come now," he called, opening his arms. She let herself run. He caught her, and together they stood, watching the dark water scoop at the raw edge of the bank. The parcel had sailed out of sight. "It doesn't matter," she said. He held her close and kissed her. There was only room for their 4 feet. "It's a swindle," he said. "But there's a rut where a man has been, so if we go on I guess we shall find the path again." The river slid and twined its great volume. On the other bank cattle were feeding on the desolate flats. The cliff rose high above Paul and Clara on their right hand. They stood against the tree in a watery silence. "Let us try going forward," he said, and they struggled in the red clay along the groove a man's nailed boots had made. They were hot and flushed. Their barkled shoes hung heavy on their steps. At last they found the broken path. It was littered with rubble from the water, but at any rate it was easier. They cleaned their boots with twigs. His heart was beating thick and fast. Suddenly, coming on to the little level, he saw 2 figures of men standing silent at the water's edge. His heart leaped. They were fishing. He turned and put his hand up warningly to Clara. She hesitated, buttoned her coat. The two went on together. The fisherman turned curiously to watch the two intruders on their privacy and solitude. They had had a fire, but it was nearly out. All kept perfectly still. The men turned again to their fishing, stood over the grey glinting water like statues. Clara went with bowed head, flushing. He was laughing to himself. Directly they passed out of sight behind the willows. "Now they ought to be drowned," said Paul softly. Clara did not answer. They toiled forward along a tiny path on the river's lip. Suddenly it vanished. The bank was sheer red solid clay in front of them, sloping straight into the river. He stood and cursed beneath his breath, setting his teeth. "It's impossible," said Clara. He stood erect, looking round. Just ahead were two islets in the stream, covered with osiers. But they were unattainable. The cliff came down like a sloping wall from far above their heads. Behind, not far back, were the fishermen. Across the river the distant cattle fed silently in the desolate afternoon. He cursed again deeply under his breath. He gazed up the great steep bank. Was there no hope but to scale back to the public path? "Stop a minute," he said, and digging his heels sideways into the steep bank of red clay, he began nimbly to mount. He looked across at every tree foot. At last he found what he wanted. Two beech trees side by side on the hill held a little level on the upper face between their roots. It was littered with damp leaves, but it would do. The fishermen were perhaps sufficiently out of sight. He threw down his rainproof and waved to her to come. She toiled to his side. Arriving there, she looked at him heavily, dumbly, and laid her head on his shoulder. He held her fast as he looked round. They were safe enough from all but the small, lonely cows over the river. He sunk his mouth on her throat, where he felt her heavy pulse beat under his lips. Everything was perfectly still. There was nothing in the afternoon but themselves. When she arose, he, looking on the ground all the time, saw suddenly sprinkled on the black wet beech roots many scarlet carnation petals, like splashed drops of blood, and the red small splashes fell from her bosom, streaming down her dress to her feet. "Your flowers are smashed," he said. She looked at him heavily as she put back her hair. Suddenly he put his fingertips on her cheek. "Why dost look so heavy?" he reproached her. She smiled sadly, as if she felt alone in herself. He caressed her cheek with his fingers, and kissed her. "Nay," he said, "never thee bother." She gripped his fingers tight and laughed shakily. Then she dropped her hand. He put the hair back from her brows, stroking her temples, kissing them lightly. "But tha shouldna worrit," he said softly, pleading. "No, I don't worry." She laughed tenderly and resigned. "Yea, tha does. Dunna thee worrit," he implored, caressing. "No," she consoled him, kissing him. They had a stiff climb to get to the top again. It took them a quarter of an hour. When he got on to the level grass, he threw off his cap, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and sighed. "Now we're back at the ordinary level," he said. She sat down, panting, on the tussocky grass. Her cheeks were flushed pink. He kissed her, and she gave way to joy. "And now I'll clean thy boots and make thee fit for respectable folk," he said. He kneeled at her feet, worked away with a stick and tufts of grass. She put her fingers in his hair, drew his head to her, and kissed it. "What am I supposed to be doing?" he said, looking at her, laughing. "Cleaning shoes or dibbling with love? Answer me that." "Just whichever I please," she replied. "I'm your boot boy for the time being, and nothing else." But they remained looking into each other's eyes and laughing. Then they kissed with little nibbling kisses.